Welcome to NAMP's monthly educational webinar series. I am your host, Andrea Granson, Education Specialist for the NAMP. Today's topic is chronic fatigue syndrome, ME, and post-viral fatigue symptoms and protocols with Dr. Sarah Myhill. These webinars are recorded and can be viewed at any time by logging into the NAMP members area, where you can earn 1 continuing education credit. Okay, so let's get started. Dr. Sarah Myhill is a pioneering naturopathic physician, ecological medicine doctor, and nutritionist with over 40 years of medical experience. She began her career as a medical doctor in 1981, and for 20 years she worked as a general practitioner within the NHS. In the last 2 decades, Dr. Myhill has been working as an independent naturopathic physician, which has given her more clinical freedom to do what she believes is best for her clients. She has a special interest in chronic fatigue, ME, a complex and debilitating condition that affects millions of people worldwide. Dr. Myhill is also an award-winning author, having written 6 books and 3 scientific papers. Her books cover a wide range of topics related to health and well-being, including nutrition, energy, and stress management. She is also a sought-after lecturer, mentor, and workshop leader, and she regularly presents at conferences and events around the world. In addition to her clinical work and writing, Dr. Myhill is also a patron of the Association of Naturopathic Nutritionists and a committee member of the British Society for Ecological Medicine. Through these roles, she helps to organise training sessions for medical doctors and other healthcare professionals, sharing her expertise and knowledge within the wider community. Dr. Myhill is committed to empowering people to take control of their health and well-being through education, support, and personalised care. Welcome, Sarah. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here with us today. It's over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. I might struggle to live up to that pre-ramble.
It's well deserved. It's well deserved.
Very kind. Okay, well, thank you for inviting me. As you said, chronic fatigue and ME are areas of special interest. And for even people who don't have chronic fatigue syndrome or ME, the way we go about treating that is also the way we go about preventing pathology, in particular cancer, heart disease, and dementia. So anybody listening into this would be well advised to put in place these interventions in order that they can live life to their full potential. So that's who I am and what I do, which you've just said, so I won't hang around with that. But the point is, we learn about normal fatigue through our interest in pathological fatigue. And of course, the most recent clinical picture that describes that is long COVID. And the key point to remember about these things is that these names are not diagnoses. They are clinical pictures. And our job as a doctor should be to identify the underlying mechanisms by which those symptoms arise or by which that clinical picture arises. Because if you know what the mechanism is, then that has obvious implications for management. And chronic fatigue syndrome and ME, the words are often used interchangeably, but they are different clinical pictures. So chronic fatigue syndrome is the clinical picture that we see where the energy delivery mechanisms are impaired. By contrast, ME is chronic fatigue syndrome and inflammation. The point here is that inflammation occurs when the immune system is active, and that can be reasons for chronic infection, for reasons of allergy, and for reasons of autoimmunity. So let's start with energy delivery mechanisms, because that really is the starting point to treat, say, chronic fatigue syndrome, obviously ME, and indeed to prevent all pathology. Now, fatigue is a very important symptom. And the analogy I use comes from a quote by Charles Dickens, Mr. Micawber, annual income £20, expenditure 19 shillings and sixpence, result happiness. But if you spend more money than you have in your bank, then the result is misery. In fact, we have a certain bucket of energy to spend in a day. And if you spend more energy than is available to your body and to your brain, then you will die. Because if you don't have energy delivery mechanisms in place, then the heart will fail, the brain will fail, and all organs will fail. And of course, the first example of this is the messenger Philippides, who brought the news of the great victory from Marathon, and he ran, the 27 point whatever miles it is, in order to inform the king of the Greeks. And he used up all the energy that he'd got, and he died on arrival because he had no energy left for life. Now, that might be slightly apocryphal, but it illustrates the point. So the point here is that in life, there is no such thing as negative equity. We can't borrow energy against the future. I know we do that financially in the modern world, and it's not a healthy state of affairs. But in life, as I say, if energy spending exceeds energy delivery, then we die. So how does the body know how much energy it's got? How does the brain know how much energy it's got? And how does it prevent us from spending that energy? And the answer is, it gives us symptoms. And these symptoms have to be very unpleasant symptoms, because if they're not unpleasant, then we will simply die. So what we then have to ask ourselves, well, what are those symptoms going to be? And the key point here is that symptoms are, as I call it, the red flags that warn us of pathology. So this doesn't just apply to fatigue, it also applies to pain. So the classic example I give is if you had a stone in your shoe, so it was very painful under your foot, then what you would do is you would take the shoe off, you'd have a look, you'd find the stone, you'd take the stone away, and all would be well. But doctors don't do that anymore. They wouldn't be looking for that stone. They'd say, oh, you better have a painkiller to stop the pain. And then as that stone eroded through the hole in the foot, you would then have an infected foot, and then you get an antibiotic. And then the antibiotic would stop working, and you'd end up with gangrene. So the point here is, it's so vital to attend to symptoms, to ask the question, what is going on here? Because if you don't ask that question, you won't get the mechanism. And the shameful thing is, doctors no longer ask the question why. Modern medicine has just been reduced to symptom suppression with drugs, which drives more pathology and disease, and there's a progression downhill as a result. So this is the book that I wrote about pathological fatigue. This is the book that I wrote about normal fatigue. And the point here is that symptom of fatigue is incredibly common. When I started in general practice in the 1980s, the TATT, the tired all the time symptom, constituted 40% of GP consultations. People don't go and consult their doctors about fatigue anymore because they get very little help from them. They might get a blood test, they might get their thyroid checked, but then that test is often misinterpreted. So it's the commonest symptom that we see in Westerners, and it's also the worst treated. And as I describe in my book, the naked ape has evolved into the knackered ape. And fatigue is an incredibly common symptom and very badly treated. And in fact, all the things that we're going to talk about are equally applicable to athletes. If athletes wish to improve their performance, then they need to it's not just a case of training, they need to put in place interventions to improve energy delivery to the muscles for very obvious reasons. Okay, so we then have to ask ourselves, well, what are the symptoms of poor energy delivery mechanisms? And the most obvious symptom is physical fatigue. Now, we are all tired at the end of the day. We all know what that sensation is. But I know I should have a long day today. I should be tired at the end of the day, but I will have a good night's sleep. And tomorrow morning, I will be as right as rain. Now, the difference between normal fatigue and pathological fatigue is the delayed factor. And people with that clinical picture of chronic fatigue syndrome and ME, they suffer from delayed fatigue. If they overdo things on one day, and most of them have worked out what they are capable of doing, they pay for it the next day. And if you're doing that, that's pathological. It's a little bit like the athlete who's in a state of chronic overtraining. If you're overtraining all the time and you are fatigued the next day, you actually reduce your athletic performance. There's a lovely example of this. I remember reading a case history published in New Scientist about an old boy who was in his late 60s. His life's ambition was to run a marathon in 4 hours. And he trained and trained and trained and couldn't do it. He then had a forced break. He had to rest up for a month because of an ankle injury. He then went and he ran his marathon easily under 4 hours. So in the early stage of this disease, pacing is very boring, but it's really important. And then, of course, if you have impaired energy delivery to the brain, then the brain will go slow. And the key statistic to remember here is that 20%, although the brain just weighs 2% of energy, it consumes 20%. I beg your pardon, the brain weighs 2% of body weight, but it consumes 20% of all the energy that the body generates. It's massive. And if you impair energy delivery to the brain, then you will become a foggy brain, can't think clearly, inability to multitask, can't concentrate. Sometimes people say they read a book and they have to go back and read it again because they've literally lost the plot. In fact, some of the patients who come and talk to me, they tell me, I think I'm going demented because I've got all the symptoms that, Nan had, when she died. And the answer is, well, they're not going demented, but you can reverse dementia with improving energy delivery mechanisms, and you can reverse the foggy brain in people with fatigue syndromes by improving energy delivery mechanisms. And then, of course, if you do if energy delivery is impaired, there is a way that the body can get instant energy without oxygen, and that's called anaerobic metabolism. And if you go into anaerobic metabolism, and of course, this is what athletes do at the end of a long race. If they are running 10,000 meters, they run every circuit at about, 62, 63 seconds if they're in the top league. And then the last circuit, they sprint. How they do it, I don't know. But in sprinting, they go into anaerobic metabolism. And at the point at which they're crossing the line, they're absolutely bottomed out. They don't have an iota of energy to spend. And their muscles are aching. And that's due to lactic acid burn. And so if you have poor energy delivery, aerobic energy delivery, you go into anaerobic metabolism and you get painful muscles. So painful muscles are another symptom of poor energy delivery mechanisms. And of course, the brain then gives us symptoms to prevent us from spending energy. The most obvious one is depression. I think depression is a feature of poor energy delivery mechanisms because when you're depressed, you don't want to do things. You don't want to spend energy. You want to curl up and you want to be antisocial. And of course, being with people and talking takes energy. You want to curl up in a ball. You want to kiss goodbye to the world. And that's the way that the brain protects us or prevents us from spending energy. And that is often reflected in our face because people who are tired, they look miserable, they look sad, and therefore, guess what? You don't want to engage with them. Another very useful clue is that people start to use addictions to deal with their fatigue. And very often people use caffeine to kind of fire them up, to give them a bit more energy. They use sugar to fire them up, to give them a bit more energy. But of course, you can't have an upper without a downer. And you might have a temporary boost in energy, but then you get an energy dive. So as soon as somebody says, oh, I can't function without my coffee or without my sugar hit in the morning, then suspect poor energy delivery mechanisms are cutting in. Doctors are even worse because they have yet to wake up to the fact that many of the drugs that they're using are addictive and in the short term may give ease, but in the long term give pain. And many drugs for psychological conditions are simply symptom suppressing. They're not getting at root causes. And then there are some things we do, like we procrastinate, we do things the next day. If the immune system doesn't have good energy delivery mechanisms, then you'll pick up every cough and cold that's going on. And of course, poor libido is a typical symptom of fatigue. That's nature telling us you don't have the energy for babies, you don't have the energy for pregnancy and child rearing. So we're not going to give you the sex hormones to give you the desire for such. And again, poor posture. Okay, so the converse of that is what is it like to have good energy delivery mechanisms? And of course, we feel well, we wake up in the morning, you can't wait to get going. Even after a busy day, you still got some energy left. If you've got good energy delivery to the brain, then you feel confident, optimistic, easygoing. You can read as well as I can. I don't need to read that out. And that's reflected in the face. So people with energy have got happy, smiley faces and they're jolly. People who are miserable, the opposite is true. So when I see a patient who comes to me with a fatigue, then the first thing we have to do is to manage the energy bucket that you do have, and that's called pacing. It's very boring, but in the early stage, it's essential, because if you pace well, you will get better quicker. And the reason for that is if you're constantly overdoing things, if you're constantly pushing yourself to your limit, then you will go into anaerobic metabolism and produce lactic acid. Now, we've touched on that already, but lactic acid is painful, but it also inhibits mitochondrial function directly. And mitochondria are the engines of our car. It's with mitochondria that we generate the ATP necessary to do things. And if you inhibit mitochondria, then they're going to go slow. So it's like clogging your engine up by sticking a plug in the exhaust pipe or something like that. And again, when we burn acetate fuel in order to generate ATP, if we burn that anaerobically, we produce just 2 molecules of ATP. If we burn it aerobically, we produce 36 molecules. But to get back from glucose, back from lactic acid to pyruvate requires 6 molecules. Here's the biochemistry of that. So this is when we're going into anaerobic metabolism and we're producing just 2 molecules of ATP, and the byproduct of that is lactic acid. But the lactic acid gets into the bloodstream as lactate, and to get back to glucose and pyruvate, it requires 6 molecules of ATP. So the point here is it's like borrowing money from a loan shark at about 300% interest. It's a rotten deal. So early on, pacing is important. And then the next thing I talk about is the mechanisms by which we generate energy in the body. Because I'm asking people to do difficult things. I'm asking people to change their diet, to take supplements, to think about things, and they say they're hard. And so people have got to get it. I've got to give them the intellectual imperative to make the difficult changes that are necessary. And there are 4, and I would probably add to that another one, mechanisms to generate energy in the body. First of all, we need the right fuel in the tank. And that's all about diet and gut function. And that has to be done first. In the past, I used to give people lists of things to do. And guess what? They would cherry pick. Oh, the diet looks a bit tricky, but I don't mind taking a few supplements. And it didn't work. And the reason for that we'll come to in a moment. But it's important to do these things, and we have to do them in the right order. And the first thing is the fuel in the tank, which is diet and gut function. Then we need the engine to burn that fuel, and that's my special area of interest. You mentioned earlier I published 3 papers. They're all about mitochondrial function in patients with fatigue syndromes. Thirdly, and I need to add this in, we need oxygen in order to burn that fuel in mitochondria, and that's all about breathing correctly. Fourthly, we need the control mechanisms right, the adrenal gland, the thyroid accelerator pedal, and the adrenal gearbox. And if we can concentrate on those fundamentals, as I say, not only can you get well, but you can avoid pathology in the future. So we always start off with the fuel in the tank. And this drove me to write one of my early books, the paleo-ketogenic diet, the why and the how. And there are 2 aspects to this diet. First of all, it needs to be ketogenic. It needs to be a keto diet because that is the preferred fuel of mitochondria. You can reverse dementia with a ketogenic diet. You can massively slow the growth of cancer with a ketogenic diet. You can prevent damage to blood vessels, i.e. heart disease and atherosclerosis, with a ketogenic diet. So this is a vital starting point. The second part of the diet is it needs to be paleo. No dairy products, no gluten grains. Neither are evolutionarily correct foods. So this is the why we should be eating a paleo-ketogenic diet, because that's what humans evolved doing over hundreds of thousands, nay, millions of years. And we have a gut, we have a whole metabolism that is perfectly suited to a paleo-ketogenic diet. And, we ain't going to change our gut metabolism in a few decades of human life, but we can change our diet. And as Hippocrates famously said, Let medicine be thy food and food be thy medicine. Always start with diet. And I probably talk more about food and diet and gut function than all other subjects put together. So I'm mindful I've got an hour to speak. And if I speak the first half of it on food and diet, forgive me, but that is the single most important thing you have to do. Don't cherry pick the easy things. And in addition to that, we need to take a basic package of supplements, because the bottom line is that there's been a one-way cycle of minerals from the soil, plants, animals into us, and we throw that away. We discard it. So we are not recycling nutrients back onto the soil. This is a statement that was made that these fruits, vegetables and grains no longer contain nutrients. And when was this written? 1936, nearly 100 years ago. And believe you me, it's a lot worse now. So we all need a basic package of supplements, good multivitamin, minerals, essential fatty acids, vitamin D and vitamin C. And then I'm going to whiz through this a little bit. Many people who have fatigue are overweight, and they try to reduce calories and starve themselves to lose weight, but that simply makes them more fatigued. We can talk about how to lose weight later if you so wish, but it's really important to make sure you're eating sufficient calories, and those calories need to come from fat and from fiber, not from sugar and starches. Again, we need to just check how much protein you're taking, because, and this was based on a fascinating study where they looked at, they started off with insects. They put insects on low protein diets, and the insects ate and ate and ate until they had satisfied their protein requirements. And in the process of doing so, they ate too much and they got fat. By contrast, insects that were given a high protein diet, they satisfied their protein requirements very quickly, they underate, and they all got thin. So we need the right amount of protein. It's not a high protein diet, it's not a low protein diet, it's a normal protein diet. Fiber is the fuel that we want to power our body with, because fuel is fermented in the large bowel to produce ketone bodies, short chain fatty acids, which are highly desirable. And of course, the microbiome, we've got 1 or maybe 2 kilograms of microbes in our gut. They work like another organ of the body. And for that microbiome to do good to us, we have to feed it with fiber. And the way we judge this is by using the Bristol stool chart. You should produce a daily turd that's about the size and the shape of a cucumber, which is not ridged and is passed effortlessly. And that gives you about the right amount of fiber. And if you're not sure what to look at, well, here you are. You can get the T-shirt. You'll be pleased to hear. And you want one that's like this on the Bristol stool chart. Not bitty, not sloppy, a nice, smooth, frictionless turd. And then, of course, fats and oils are so important. And we should be fueling our bodies with fat, because that is broken down to ketones, which are very desirable fuel for our mitochondria. And there was a big debate in the 1970s between fat as a fuel and sugars and carbohydrates. So fat was being driven by, not Hon Yog, that should be John Yudkin. I missed a letter there. He was a British physiologist, and he said then that this is the most important fuel for us. And of course, when I was a child in the 1960s, we used to go to work on an egg. Mum used to fry up every morning. It was bacon and eggs and fried bread with lots of fat. And that kept us going all morning. We didn't get hungry, obviously, until lunchtime. Westerners fuel their bodies with sugars and carbohydrates, which are addictive and bad news. So as Dr. Gabriela Segura, consultant cardiologist, says, let fat be thy medicine and medicine be thy fat. High-fat diets are very good for us. And the point here is that all fats are good fats. All fats in nature that are good fats. I say we should be powering our bodies with a saturated fat. Now, a saturated fat is a biochemical term. It means that the carbon backbone of your fat is straight. And it's saturated with hydrogen ions with a carbon CH4 group and all the way around. So it's a short, stiff, tough molecule. Now, we do have fats that are unsaturated fats, and it might be a monounsaturated fat or a polyunsaturated fat. A monounsaturated means it's got a kink at one position, mono. There's a carbon double bond there. And polysaturated means it's kinked at two positions. It's kinked at the elbow as well, maybe. So that would be an omega-3, 6 polyunsaturated fat. But in nature, these are all left-handed. Now, I'm putting my left hand up. I see it looks like the right hand in the picture, but never mind. These are all left-handed oils, and they are generally a liquid at room temperature. But if you heat them or you hydrogenate them in margarine, they flip to a right-handed oil, and that's called a trans fat. And they are very bad news, and they clog up the system. So the rules here: always cook with a saturated fat, lard, beef fat, dripping, butter if you're sure you're not allergic to it. That's the only dairy products that's permitted on the PK diet, coconut oil or whatever, because they are saturated fats. And then with the unsaturated, always have them cold pressed and cold. Drizzle them on your food, use them in your French dressing, make mayonnaise with them, but do not cook with them. It's lethal. Now, you might think that I'm maligning all carbohydrates, but that's not the case. Carbohydrates are an essential part of our diet. We can't survive without them. The problem is we are overwhelmed with them. The problem is that we have too many carbohydrates, and we eat them in an addictive way. We can't stop eating them. But carbohydrates are essential. They are essential to make a 5-carbon sugar, which is the raw material to make the energy molecule ATP, and also DNA and RNA. And we also use sugar for detoxification. It's a pathway in the liver called glucuronidation. We use it to get rid of nasties in the body that we can do without. A small percentage of the population, possibly up to 10%, have lost the ability to do that. And they have something called Gilbert syndrome, or rather Gilbert syndrome, because he was a Frenchman. And they're at greater risk of poisoning the rest of the population. That can be greatly mitigated by taking glutathione. And you can diagnose Gilbert syndrome very easily. You have a high bilirubin, a tendency to go jaundice very easily, and it tends to run in families. So it's a very simple biochemical tip to prevent complications of Gilbert's. So what we have to do is get into ketosis. And what's very useful is to measure. And I'm not going to talk about this because I see we're going to run out of time otherwise, but a ketone breath meter is very helpful. So instead of people coming to me and saying, am I in ketosis or not, you can get a ketone breath meter and you can measure to make sure that you are in ketosis. And the details of how to do that are in the book. And we can get ketones because of fat burning. So you could breath test, or you could do a urine test to pick up acetoacetate, or you could do a blood test to pick up beta-hydroxybutyric acid. That is the most reliable test, but the testing strips are expensive and you have to prick your finger. And guess what? I'm a wimp. And as Hippocrates famously said, before you heal someone, ask him if he's willing to give up the things that make him sick. And for most people, it's sugar and carbohydrate addiction. And if they're not prepared to give up their bread and their biscuits and their fruit, well, move on. Find another doctor, because I'm not going to be able to help them if they're not able to do that. So having got the diet in place, we then have to establish the upper fermenting gut. Now, this is a very important issue, and it's extremely common. So before we can talk about what the upper fermenting gut is, we have to talk about what the normal gut does. Now, the normal gut is the upper gut, the first 20 feet of esophagus, stomach, duodenum, jejunum, small intestine, should be near sterile. It should be a carnivorous gut, like a dog or a cat's gut, where proteins are broken down by stomach acid, by pancreatic enzymes, where fats are emulsified with bile salts, and foods are absorbed in the upper gut. But by contrast, the lower gut, the microbiome, which we've touched upon, the last 3 foot of gut, that's where the microbes should be. That's where we should have lots of fermentation going on of fiber, and that does much good for the body. Now, problems arise when we eat too many sugars and carbohydrates, because we overwhelm the ability of the upper gut to remain sterile. And if that happens, the bugs move in and they start to ferment. And those microbes might be bacteria, they might be yeast, they might be aerobic bacteria, they might be anaerobic bacteria, they may be parasites or whatever, or obviously fungi. But this causes major problems, and these are the problems. First of all, they poison us. These microbes ferment foods to all these nasty substances here that I've detailed. It's called the auto-brewery syndrome. It's an acute poisoning. And very often people tell me when they get onto the diet, the first thing they notice is their foggy brain is better. Why? Because they're not being poisoned by all these alcohols, which includes ethyl alcohol, of course, which is why it's called the auto-brewery syndrome. And I mean, if I had to have a glass of wine for breakfast, guess what? I'm not going to function for the rest of the morning. The other problem is that these microbes themselves produce toxins. If you look at life from the point of view of a microbe, it doesn't want its comfortable ecological niche invaded by another. So they all produce natural toxins. We produce bacterial endotoxin, fungal mycotoxin. In fact, the fungal mycotoxin that we all know about are called antibiotics. Most antibiotics come from fungi. They're what fungi produce to keep other microbes at bay. The obvious one is penicillin that we all know about, but most antibiotics have a fungal name, streptomycin, cephalosporin, for example. And these toxins, they spill over from the gut into the portal vein, which is how the blood is drained from there, and to the liver. And the liver has to detoxify these toxins, and that takes up a huge amount of energy. So that kicks a hole in the energy bucket, as I call it. And then, of course, the gases produced by upper gut fermentation cause burping and bloating. They distend the gut, and that is painful. Another major thing to consider is that when microbes do colonize the lining of the gut, they cause inflammation there. And that's a problem because that causes leaky gut. And if you've got leaky gut, you're going to have a whole heap of problems because, first of all, you can't concentrate acid. And if you can't concentrate acid, then you're not going to break down protein very well. If you can't concentrate acid, you can't absorb minerals sufficiently. And thirdly, you can't sterilize the upper gut. And a sterile upper gut is a major defense against infection. 90% of infection comes in through the gut. The reason for that is we breathe in through the nose, and that microbes stick to sticky mucus, which drops down the back of the throat, washed up by cilia in the lining of the bronchi, coughed up and swallowed. Or we get microbes from the food that we eat. Those microbes need to land in an acid bath of a stomach where they are sterilized, stops us getting infected. The other important thing here is if you've got leaky gut, then the microbes themselves get from the gut into the bloodstream. And the immune system sees them. It sees bacteria wherever they may end up, and that drives inflammation. And I'm quite sure that allergy to microbes from the upper fermenting gut is a major driver of pathology. I've listed some there: inflammatory bowel disease, arthritis, fibromyalgia, intrinsic asthma. You can read as well as I can, but it's a major driver of disease. And then, of course, if the lining of the gut is chronically inflamed, we know that drives cancer. And my guess is that chronic inflammation of the gut is driving cancer of the stomach and esophagus, both of which are on the increase since we introduced sugars and carbohydrates into Western diets, in bulk, since the early 1980s, really. And then, of course, if you've got an inflamed gut, you've got an inflamed brain. Another useful way to know that you are doing the diet correctly, other than those symptoms, is what goes on in the colon, because fiber that we should be consuming, feeding the friendly microbes in the large bowel, they ferment to produce methane and hydrogen. So we should be farting, we should be passing wind, but you shouldn't be able to smell it. It's odorless. You can test for it by putting a match to it. Not that I recommend that as a clinical test, I have to say. If your farts are offensive, if they are smelly, then that means that you are not digesting protein efficiently. And protein is getting from the upper gut into the lower gut, where it is being fermented to produce hydrogen sulfide. So that's a very useful clinical clue as to whether your gut function is working well. So now we understand what's going on with the upper fermenting gut. There's an obvious three-pronged approach. First of all, starve out the fermenters with the paleo-ketogenic diet, because, as I say, they can only ferment sugars and carbohydrates. Do a low sugar carbohydrate diet and you starve them out. Normalize digestion, and for some people, chewing food is very important. That stimulates the whole process of digestion downstream. And then we kill them with vitamin C to bowel tolerance. and then we kill them with iodine taken last thing at night. The key thing here is take vitamin C away from iodine, because one is electron donor, the other is an electron receiver. They knock each other out. So don't take them together, take them apart. So now we have in a fit state to start looking after our mitochondrial engine. This is the, oh, hang on. I forgot one bit that we must talk about first. No, we can do that after. Beg your pardon. Okay, so for your engine, of course, we need the right fuel in the tank. Well, we've done that, haven't we? The next thing your mitochondrial engine needs, of course, is oxygen. Now, I've not put this in this presentation, but I'm going to talk about it because it's so important. The way that the body delivers oxygen to mitochondria is in the bloodstream. Oxygen is in our air that we inhale, and in the lungs, oxygen hops onto a hemoglobin, like jumping onto a bus. It's then carried around the body to where it's needed, and then oxygen hops off to be delivered to mitochondria. We have to ask the question: how does oxygen know to jump onto hemoglobin in the lungs and to jump off hemoglobin where it's needed to supply mitochondria? And the answer is the acidity of the blood determines this. And the acidity of the blood is largely determined by carbon dioxide. Now, of course, carbon dioxide is the waste gas that happens when mitochondria have burnt up the fuel they're getting from acetate groups. And that carbon dioxide dissolves in the bloodstream as carbonic acid. So where mitochondria are busy and producing a lot of CO2, the blood is very acidic, and therefore oxygen hops off. Conversely, in the lungs, where we are exhaling, carbon dioxide is being washed out of the bloodstream. So the bloodstream becomes more alkali, and therefore oxygen hops on board hemoglobin. So it's a very clever system. But the problem arises when we breathe too much. And this is extraordinarily common. Breathing is driven by adrenaline. One of the things that drives it is adrenaline, one of the stress hormones, and in a stress state. And that is very common in people who are eating sugars and carbs, because every time your blood sugar drops, you spike adrenaline. So many people end up over-breathing, hyperventilating. And the problem with that is if you breathe too much, you wash carbon dioxide out of the blood becomes too alkali, and oxygen is not delivered to the tissues. It remains stuck on hemoglobin. So your oxygen saturations, when they're measured, might be normal, but that's oxygen in the blood that's being measured, not oxygen in the tissues. So breathing correctly is very, very important. And the three important points about this is, first of all, breathe through the nose. Many people mouth breathe, and that increases the dead space and washes out carbon dioxide. Secondly, use your diaphragm to breathe. And thirdly, slow the breathing down. And these hyperventilation exercises were described by Buteyko first. So if you want to know how to do them, look at the Buteyko method. Okay, so now we've got the fuel to our mitochondria, and we've got oxygen to our mitochondria. And the next thing we need are the raw materials, freedom from toxic stress, so that our mitochondria work well. Now, I'm going to whiz through this a little bit because we don't need to know this, but you're welcome to have the slides and send them on to your listeners or whatever. But the point is, during the 1990s, I was thinking then that mitochondria are an essential part of energy delivery mechanisms, and therefore a pathological issue in patients with fatigue syndromes. And thanks to the most brilliant biochemist in the world, Dr. John McLaren Howard, he developed tests of mitochondrial studies that looked at how ATP was generated in mitochondria. The point being that any one of those processes going slow would result in poor energy delivery mechanisms. And because he was measuring the efficiency of every process, detailed in this last slide, how quickly ATP is made, how efficiently it is got from the mitochondria into the cell and then returned, we could develop a mitochondrial energy score, i.e. an objective measure of how efficiently mitochondria are working in those patients. And this led us to a study. So by this time, I collected 71 patients who were not responding to my usual regimes, and I did the blood tests. Dr. John McLaren Howard did the biochemistry, and we independently sent our results to Professor Norman Booth at Mansfield College, Oxford, who put them together. So although it wasn't placebo-controlled double-blind, it was done blinded, because I didn't know what the mitochondrial energy scores were. Dr. John McLaren Howard didn't know how fatigued the patients were. The data went to a third party. And this resulted in our first paper that was published in the International Journal of Clinical and Experimental Medicine. And the key graph that came from that was this one here. It was an extraordinarily profound correlation. Those people who had the worst levels of energy had the worst mitochondrial function, and vice versa. It was almost a straight line graph. It was an extraordinary result. And this was the first paper in the world that detailed the importance of mitochondrial function in people with fatigue syndromes. We then went on to put in place the necessary interventions, because we know from that study, because John was also measuring the levels of the common rate limiting steps like magnesium, CoQ10, acetyl-carnitine, vitamin B3, and each patient then received a tailored regime. We then followed them up, and these are the graphs that came from this. Now, so the purple is the mitochondrial energy score before, and the orange is the mitochondrial energy score after the package of treatment. And these first 30 patients all did the package. And these 4, for reasons best known to themselves, did not do the interventions. They didn't do the keto diet, they didn't take the supplements or whatever. And what was so fascinating is if the clients did the regimes, we improved mitochondrial function reliably well, and vice versa. Now, the important point about this is that you don't have to do mitochondrial function tests to get well, because we know these regimes work. You just have to put the correct fuel in the tank, give the mitochondria the raw materials to work, reduce the toxic stress that's inhibiting mitochondrial function, and then correct the control mechanisms. So let's go through those issues. So these are the raw materials that mitochondria need daily for their enzyme systems to work. I'm not going to read these out because you can all read perfectly well. But as I say, this is not what I think. This is fact, and it's borne out by scientific evidence and, of course, decades of clinical experience. I reckon I must have seen, well, certainly thousands of patients with fatigue syndromes and ME. Then we have to get rid of the factors that are inhibiting mitochondria. And we know these because John went on to develop tests of translocated protein function, which tell us why mitochondria go slow. And here are the common issues. Lactic acid, well, we've done that, haven't we? Because, our patients are pacing themselves well. Products of the upper fermenting gut, well, guess what? We've done that because people are doing a PK diet, taking vitamin C and iodine. Diamino compounds, hair dyes and colorants appear very commonly stuck onto mitochondria, and they inhibit mitochondria extremely well. And then you can read the other things here that I'm not going to read out because I'm assuming you can all read, and I'm noticing the time is slipping away. So there are 4 groups of toxin, and I put them in this group deliberately because this accords with the detox regimes we need to put in place in order to get rid of them. Well, first of all, products of the upper fermenting gut. Well, guess what? We've sorted that out, haven't we? Pesticides and volatile organic compounds. You don't have to measure them, but they come out reliably well with heating regimes. And I will show you the data that I've accumulated that illustrate that point. It might be toxic metals, and we can measure that with a urine test using a chelating agent, or it might be products of infection, because we know many microbes block mitochondrial function. It's a very clever mechanism that they have evolved because mitochondria mean that the immune system has lots of energy, and that can kill the microbes. So these are clever mechanisms that have been evolved to stop the immune system fighting infection. So this is the data that I collected from over 30 patients that have done toxicity tests before and after heating regimes. The details are there. You might say, oh, 30 patients, that's not very many. But the point is, the tests again show that the toxins come out reliably well. This has also been done by Dr. Bill Ray in America. He looked at 210 patients then, exactly the same techniques. I copied him because he came first. And we know these regimes are very efficient. And roughly speaking, 50 heating regimes, and that might be Epsom salt baths, it might be sauning, it might be sunbathing, will halve the body load. The chemicals come out exponentially. So those are the details, the heating regimes that I use. And then, of course, we need, so what have we got here? Oh, these are, I beg your pardon. These are other ways by which we can detoxify. I'm not going to go through all that. Those are what we use. These are the mechanisms by which they help us to detox. And those are the sort of doses of micronutrients we need to achieve that. So at this stage, of course, we would like to think that our mitochondria are sorted. And at this point, we put in place the control mechanisms. That's the thyroid accelerator pedal and the adrenal gearbox. That's the analogy that I like to use. Both the thyroid hormones and adrenals impact on energy delivery mechanisms. Thyroid's essentially base load, so they give us, they allow our car to run along at a steady 50 miles an hour. And adrenal hormones allow us to go faster or slower according to immediate demands. So adrenaline is the instant kick hormone that kicks the mitochondria into action, so we can go suddenly at 120 miles an hour to escape some sort of stress or strain. DHEA, I beg your pardon, the adrenaline is then followed by cortisol, which mitigates that action. And then there's DHEA, which functions over hours and days. So adrenaline is seconds and minutes. Cortisol functions over minutes and hours. DHEA over hours and days. And they help to control our mitochondria. But if we are chronically stressed all the time and pushing our mitochondria all the time, eventually they will collapse. Eventually it's unsustainable. And that's often what triggers a chronic fatigue syndrome or an ME. And people tell me that their illness was often triggered by some sort of unremitting stress, which might be a physical stress, it might be a mental stress, it might be emotional stress, or often it's all three. So this just illustrates the point, you've got to do things in the right order, because if the mitochondria are not in a fit state to respond, then you really are flogging a dead horse. And so you don't even think about looking at a thyroid function or adrenal function until you've got the mitochondria in place. So then we think about thyroid and adrenal, and we tend to do these two things together. Now, I've written a book about this, and I have a feeling that that was published since this PowerPoint preparation was prepared, so I can't show you a picture of it, but the details are in there. But the point is they allow us to match energy delivery to energy demand so that we spend energy incredibly efficiently. And again, when we're asking, do we have a thyroid problem? Always start with the symptoms. And this is key because you can't diagnose a thyroid problem on blood tests alone. The diagnosis of the underactive thyroid depends on, yes, the blood test, but also the clinical picture. And we adjust the dose of thyroid hormones by, yes, the blood test, but we fine tune with the clinical picture how you feel. So this is why it's so important to understand the sort of symptoms that the underactive thyroid can give you, because we're going to use this to fine tune the dose of thyroid hormones should they be required. So if the thyroid is underactive, then a common symptom is fluid retention, puffy face, large tongue, blocked sleep apnea, obstructive sleep apnea, sometimes with snoring, which can wake you in the night, voice changes. If the vocal cords become edematous and swell, then you lose your voice and you get a croaky voice like that, like what you've been smoking for 20 years, but you haven't. So voice changes are common. Some people tell me they've lost their singing voice. If you get swelling in the tissues of the wrist, you can get carpal tunnel syndrome, pressure on the median nerve, which presents with numbness and pins and needles in those fingers there, often at night, sometimes relieved by cocking the wrists up like that. You can get nerve compressions in the sciatica can present with this, and sometimes even femoral nerve can be crushed. You need thyroid hormones to be able to fat burn. And a very common clue here is people really struggle to get into ketosis and stay in ketosis. So when they do the paleo ketogenic diet, they feel as if they're hypoglycemic all the time. They don't feel any better. And the reason for this is if you haven't got the thyroid hormones to fat burn with, then you will fat burn with adrenaline instead. And that gives you the wired but tired feeling. It makes you feel hypoglycemic because, of course, many of the symptoms of hypoglycemia are adrenaline symptoms. So struggling with the diet, always think thyroid. Sleep disturbance, again, is very typical. We know what controls our sleep, what wakes us up in the day, of course, is full spectrum light. The more full spectrum light you can get, the better. As light falls at night, the pineal gland starts to produce melatonin. Melatonin levels start to rise as darkness falls. Melatonin stimulates the pituitary gland to produce thyroid stimulating hormone, and that spikes at about midnight. Thyroid that's stimulating morning then trots around the body in the bloodstream to the thyroid gland, kicks the thyroid gland into life, and that produces T4. T4 is relatively inactive, called T4 because it's got 4 iodine atoms, and that spikes at midnight. T4 is then slowly converted into T3, and T3 then spikes at about 5 o'clock in the morning. I beg your pardon, T4 spikes at 4 o'clock in the morning. T3 then spikes at 5 o'clock in the morning. That trots around to the adrenal glands, kicks them into life, and the adrenals then pour out cortisol and adrenaline, and that wakes you up with light at 6, 7 o'clock in the morning. So if the thyroid is malfunctioning, or even if the adrenals are malfunctioning, then you become an owl. You tend to go to bed late and wake up late. And this is a feature of many of my patients with fatigue syndromes. They don't drop off to sleep until 11 o'clock or midnight, and they don't wake naturally until 8, 9, or maybe 10 o'clock in the morning. So that's another clue that the thyroid is an issue. Proximal myopathy, difficulty getting out of a chair, difficulty doing press-ups, so weakness of the shoulder muscles or the thigh muscles is common. Constipation, headaches, I'm not quite sure of the mechanism of that, but it's certainly a very common feature. And then there are signs of poor energy delivery mechanisms, in particular low temperature. And this is a very useful clinical sign. I recommend people get themselves a device like this. It's very quickly and easy to measure your core temperature. It gives you a reading, very quickly. So there I am, 36.8. So, I'm functioning well. And if your core temperature is low, then that's typical of poor energy delivery mechanism. Obviously, your car heater isn't going to come on until your car's running at a decent speed. Low blood pressure is a feature of this because if you've got poor energy delivery to the heart, it cannot beat powerfully as a pump, and therefore the blood pressure starts to fall. Now, this is often masked by the adrenaline of metabolic syndrome or ketogenic hypoglycemia, so don't rely on blood pressure too strongly. And again, a slow pulse is often a feature of the underactive thyroid. Learn to check your pulse. Then if we suspect the underactive thyroid, we put in the bare minimum to treat the thyroid, to assess the thyroid gland. We want a TSH, a free T4, and a free T3. And if that tells us that there's biochemical scope, and I see the time, the clock is ticking away, if that indicates biochemical scope for a trial of thyroid, then we can do that. And you can try thyroxine or natural desiccated thyroid or glandulars such as Metavit. Now, the details of how to do all this are all in my book. And I've been very naughty. I've called the book The Underactive Thyroid, Do It Yourself Because Your Doctor Won't. Now, I'm sure this is going to get me into trouble with the General Medical Council again, but hey-ho. The point here being is that you have to do it yourself. There is nobody who's going to be better motivated or in a better position to assess how you are and your response to treatment than yourself. So learn to do it yourself. If necessary, get the book and the details are in there. And then in parallel with the thyroid gland, we also look at the adrenal gearbox. And broadly speaking, if you're young, if you're much younger than 40, it's unlikely this is going to be a problem. If you're much older than 40, it's more likely it's going to be an issue. And my guess is by the time you get to 60 or over, we probably all need a bit of adrenal support. But this is a typical adrenal stress profile done on a saliva sample. So it's a very easy test to do. You can do it at home. And this measures cortisol levels over 24 hours. And as you can see, this person got low cortisol level, which is typical of adrenal fatigue. And interestingly, this person's also got a very flat diurnal rhythm. And of course, that's typical of the underactive thyroid, because they're not getting a thyroid kick in the morning to bring the cortisol levels up to here where it should be. There should be a very clear diurnal rhythm of cortisol. So obviously the treatment of that would be to try to identify the underlying causes. Why is that person chronically stressed and therefore have a tired, a fatigued adrenal gland? And then use adrenal support, which might be pregnenolone, it could be DHEA, adrenal glandulars, and in fact, sometimes the herbal preparations are popular, such as ashwagandha, 1 to 4 grams a day, or ginseng, 1 to 2 grams. They're also very useful. So to improve energy delivery mechanisms, we have to do it all, and we have to do it in the right order. And that is a resume of all that needs to be done. Now, I'm mindful I've left myself with 5 minutes to cover ME, which is the immunological hole in the energy bucket. I can't do it in 5 minutes. I might have to ask Andrea to invite me back for another session. But in a nutshell, the immune system is activated for reasons of chronic allergy, and we've covered that a little bit with the paleo-ketogenic diet, because of autoimmunity or because of chronic infection. And that chronic infection can be viral, it can be bacterial, it can be fungal. In America, probably the commonest bacterial driver is Lyme disease. The common viral driver is Epstein-Barr, or as you call it, mono. Fungal infections, again, they come from the fermenting gut or from environmental exposures to fungi, or maybe chronic fungal infection of the airways, which can be fairly easily treated. So I'm going to stop screen sharing and ask Andrea if she would like to ask any questions. I hope I've been clear. If I've not been clear, then please say so, and I will try and make sense of what I've said.
You have been absolutely fantastic, Sarah. I, of course, know you're a wealth of knowledge. I've heard you speak many times, and I have many of your books. I've written so many notes here and all sorts of things. One of the reasons why iodine at night?
Oh, it doesn't matter. You can take it any time of day, so long as it's away from vitamin C.
Oh, okay, right.
Because iodine is an oxidizing agent, it's electron donor. Vitamin C is a reducing agent, it's electron acceptor. They knock each other out. So as long as they're separated by a couple of hours, anytime.
Oh, that's fantastic. You mentioned we could have the slides. That would be an enormous help. We would absolutely love to have you back. I'm going to call this CFS part 1 and then ME part 2. And then once I've shared this with our audience, no doubt we will have plenty of questions to come through, because rather than me present mine, I'd love for our audience to present theirs. As you know, I do work with many people with chronic fatigue. Also, I have a Gilbert syndrome, by the way. So that was very interesting what you shared with that, because I wasn't quite aware of that mechanism, which, as you shared, was super simple. But this has been fantastic. It really has. The breathing section as well was pretty awesome. I know a lot of people do breath work and talk about it, but to understand the reasons why, and that hyperventilation, etc., very, very interesting. But yet, seriously, if you could see all my papers all over the table, I'm not the neatest of people, but I'm going to make sense of them for myself, and no doubt our people will have questions. But yes, offline, we will definitely connect and talk about the potential for doing a part 2. I know you're a super busy lady, so whenever whenever it works for your schedule. So I'm going to wrap this one up for today. Thank you so much. I'm just going to close for the audience. Once this is complete, I will send you out the recording, and I will send everybody, of course, a link to your fantastic slides. So this brings us to the end of the presentation. I want to remind everybody that this can be viewed in the NAMP members area, along with a vast selection of cutting-edge webinars. So if you have an interesting topic that you would like to present, or if you know any speakers that you would like us to host, then please do let me know by reaching out to me, andrea@namp.org. So this brings us to the end of our discussion. Thank you for listening. And Sarah, thank you so much. It's an honor and a pleasure to have you here with us today. Bye for now.
My pleasure.
Bye-bye.